How can 50,000 men annihilate an army nearly twice their size in a single afternoon? This isn't just a story of blood and swords. It's a story of genius, arrogance, and the day Rome nearly lost everything. The year is 216 BCE. Rome is the rising superpower of the Mediterranean. Its legions are feared across the world. Disciplined, relentless, unstoppable, or so they believed. For years, the Republic had been locked in a brutal struggle with Carthage, led by one man, Hannibal Barca, a commander so cunning that he dragged his army, complete with war elephants, across the Alps in the dead of winter, shocking the Romans on their own soil. By the summer of that year, the Senate had had enough. They gathered the largest army Rome had ever put into the field, close to 80,000 men. To the Romans, this wasn't just a battle. It was supposed to be the final blow that ended Hannibal once and for all. But on the dry, open plain near a small village called Cannae, their confidence would turn to terror. What happened that day would become one of the greatest military disasters in history. An entire Roman army, crushed and suffocated in one of the most brilliant tactical traps ever devised. A maneuver so flawless that military academies still teach it more than 2,000 years later. This is not just the story of a battle. It's the story of Rome's darkest nightmare and Hannibal's immortal masterpiece. Long before Cannae, the name Hannibal already carried a weight that made Romans uneasy. He wasn't just another general. He was the son of Hamilcar Barca, the Carthaginian commander who had nearly destroyed Rome in the First Punic War. According to legend, as a child, Hannibal was brought to an altar where he swore an oath of eternal hatred toward Rome. That oath became his life's mission. What made Hannibal so dangerous wasn't just his skill with soldiers. It was his unpredictability. He didn't follow the rules of war as Rome understood them. Instead of fighting head-on, he used deception, ambushes, and the terrain itself as weapons. The most shocking proof came years earlier, when he did the impossible, leading tens of thousands of men and dozens of elephants across the freezing Alps. By the time he descended into Italy, he had already beaten the odds, and Rome realized it was facing something different, something it had never encountered before. And yet, despite his victories at battles like Trebia and Lake Trasimene, Rome refused to bend. The Senate believed that sheer numbers would eventually overwhelm him, which is why in 216 BCE, they prepared the largest army in their history to finally break the Carthaginian invader. But Hannibal wasn't preparing to run. He was preparing to spring his deadliest trap. By the summer of 216 BCE, Rome had had enough of being humiliated. Their pride had already taken blow after blow, tens of thousands dead at Trebia, an entire army ambushed at Lake Trasimene. To the Senate, the solution was simple: overwhelm Hannibal with raw numbers. They raised nearly 80,000 infantry and over 6,000 cavalry, an army so massive that no commander in Roman history had ever led one so large. The consuls in charge, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, believed they could crush Hannibal in a single, decisive battle. Varro, especially, was eager for glory. His plan was direct: use the bulk of the Roman infantry to smash through Hannibal's center like a hammer. After all, why waste time with maneuvering when brute force could settle it once and for all? But across the dusty plains near the village of Cannae, Hannibal watched calmly. He knew Rome's confidence was his greatest weapon. Where they saw overwhelming numbers, he saw overconfidence. Where they saw strength, he saw an army too heavy, too tightly packed, too predictable. Hannibal had no intention of fighting on Rome's terms. The Romans thought they were marching toward an easy victory. In reality, they were walking straight into a design so precise it would be studied for centuries as the perfect trap. The plain of Cannae was wide, flat, and open, perfect for Rome's massive army to deploy. That's exactly why Varro chose it. He believed the sheer size of the legions would roll over Hannibal like a tidal wave. But Hannibal saw something else. An oven. The August sun beat down, and the dry wind whipped across the plain, carrying dust that would soon choke men and blind them. It was a battlefield designed to exhaust the Romans long before they tasted victory. When the armies formed, the difference was striking. Rome's infantry stood in a dense block, tens of thousands packed shoulder to shoulder, so tight they could barely swing their weapons. Their plan was brute force, punch through Hannibal's center and crush him by sheer weight. On the flanks, their cavalry waited, confident they could hold Carthage's riders at bay. But Hannibal's formation looked unusual, almost reckless. He placed his weakest troops, Spanish and Gallic infantry, right in the middle, with his veterans held back in reserve. The line bowed outward like a crescent, almost inviting the Romans to strike at its center. On the wings, he placed his most trusted cavalry, knowing the real battle would not be decided where the Romans expected. To the Romans, Hannibal's line looked fragile, ready to break under pressure. What they didn't realize was that this was no weakness at all. It was bait. At dawn, the dust of 80,000 Roman soldiers rose into the air like a storm cloud. Trumpets blared, shields locked, and the largest army Rome had ever assembled marched forward. The plan was simple: crush Hannibal in one overwhelming push. The first clash came on the wings. On Rome's right, their cavalry met Hannibal's Numidian horsemen, fast, agile riders who darted in and out, refusing to fight Rome head-on. On the left, Hannibal's heavier cavalry smashed into Rome's, driving them back with brutal force. While the cavalry struggled on the flanks, the heart of the battle unfolded in the center. The Romans pushed forward with relentless pressure, exactly as Hannibal expected. His Spanish and Gallic troops gave ground slowly, step by step, their crescent-shaped line bending inward. To the Romans, it seemed like victory was close. They were punching through, forcing the Carthaginian line backward. The shouts of triumph grew louder, but what looked like weakness was carefully staged. Every step backward was measured, every collapse was deliberate, and as the Roman army surged deeper into Hannibal's formation, they never noticed the jaws of the trap closing in around them. As the Roman infantry pressed forward, their massive numbers became their greatest weakness. Packed so tightly they could barely lift their arms, they kept shoving deeper into Hannibal's line, convinced the Carthaginians were breaking. But at that exact moment, Hannibal's trap snapped shut. On the flanks, his veterans surged forward. The crescent-shaped line that had been bending backward now curled inward, wrapping around the Roman sides. At the same time, Hannibal's cavalry, having crushed the Roman horsemen, swept in from behind. Dust and screams filled the air as the realization hit. The Romans weren't advancing anymore. They were surrounded. The open plain that had once seemed like their advantage had become a death cage. There was no room to maneuver, no space to fight. Men were jammed together so tightly that some suffocated before a blade even touched them. Panic spread like fire through the ranks, but there was nowhere to run. In the center of it all, Hannibal watched as his design unfolded exactly as planned. The greatest army Rome had ever assembled was now nothing more than prey, trapped in a killing circle. Once the circle closed, the battlefield became a nightmare. Tens of thousands of Romans were crushed together, unable to swing their swords or raise their shields. Some were suffocated where they stood, trampled by their own comrades before enemy blades even reached them. Others were cut down helplessly, one after another, as Carthaginian soldiers hacked their way through the human mass. What had begun as the pride of Rome was now a slaughter pen. Legionaries screamed, commanders barked frantic orders that no one could hear, and the dust mixed with blood until the air itself seemed poisoned. By the time the killing stopped, as many as 50,000 to 70,000 Romans lay dead or dying on the plain. Nearly the entire army gone in a single day. Never in its history had Rome suffered a disaster so complete, so humiliating. Senators, generals, and sons of Rome's noblest families perished together, nameless in the dirt. The survivors staggered away, broken and stunned, carrying with them only one truth. Hannibal had destroyed the myth of Roman invincibility. But while the Romans despaired, Hannibal's next move would leave historians puzzled for centuries. In the aftermath of Cannae, Hannibal stood on the threshold of history. He had wiped out the largest army Rome had ever fielded, broken their pride, and left the Republic trembling in fear. His officers urged him to march on the city itself, to finish Rome while it lay helpless. The road to the capital was open, and many believed the war could have ended right there. But Hannibal hesitated. Instead of striking at the heart of Rome, he focused on weakening it from the outside, convincing Rome's allies in Italy to abandon the Republic and join him. Some did, shaken by the scale of his victory, but Rome itself refused to break. Behind their walls, the Senate swore never to surrender, no matter the cost. This single decision, choosing not to march on Rome, would become one of the most debated moments in military history. Was Hannibal cautious, hoping to avoid a desperate siege he couldn't win? Or did he miss the one chance to destroy his enemy completely? Historians still argue over what might have been. What is certain is this. Though Cannae was his masterpiece, it marked the high point of Hannibal's campaign. Rome, bloodied but unbroken, was already preparing for revenge. When news of the disaster reached Rome, panic swept the city. Families waited for word of fathers, brothers, and sons who would never return. The Senate ordered mourning to be limited, fearing grief would paralyze the Republic. For a moment, it seemed the entire Roman world was collapsing. And yet, in the face of annihilation, Rome did not surrender. Instead of negotiating peace, the Senate raised new armies from boys barely old enough to fight and men well past their prime. They swore an oath never to yield to Hannibal, no matter how many battles he won. Over the next decade, Rome slowly adapted, avoiding pitched battles, starving Hannibal of reinforcements, and turning the war into one of endurance. A war Carthage could not win, but Cannae remained a scar on Rome's memory. Generations later, when Roman commanders faced impossible odds, they whispered one warning: beware another Cannae. Even today, more than 2,000 years later, military strategists study Hannibal's double envelopment as the perfect example of battlefield genius. In one afternoon, Hannibal carved his name into history. He shattered Rome's pride, slaughtered its legions, and crafted a victory so absolute it still echoes through time. Yet his masterpiece was also his curse, for while Cannae showed the world his brilliance, it also marked the moment when Rome, humbled but unbroken, found the resolve to become an empire.